This is a truly colossal $300 billion dollar issue. While everyone was engrossed in the $61 billion aid package to Ukraine, Congress was quietly playing a more intriguing game, not in the Ukraine Act, the Israel Act, or the Taiwan Act, but in some vague omnibus fourth bill that seemed to cover so much that it was easier for the media to get past those details. I'm guilty of that too, by the way. Excuse me, but the issue we are looking at is the seizure of some $300 billion in Russian assets controlled by Western governments. It's a touchy subject with serious implications for the war. A super scientific poll of my viewers shows that most of you support this. But whether you fall into that category or are part of the minority, and whether you call it seizure, confiscation, preemptive reparations, or special banking, both sides often overlook some of the subtleties of seizure or lack thereof. Welcome to the paradoxical world, where capture will simultaneously cause greater global instability and be a force for greater global stability. For those of us who have experienced this logical migraine, today we will look at what these frozen assets are, what caused them, and how. What the congressional bill does to channel a lot of money into the right direction. The problems that could arise with how Russia might retaliate for this seizure. What it will do to the international financial system as a whole. Why the West would get a hidden benefit by lowering the security of foreign investment there. And we'll save the best for last, a discussion of some of the borders on the maps and how the seizure undermines one of the West's key objectives in this war. But let's start with the asset basics. Let's look back a decade ago when Russia first invaded and then annexed Crimea. The West responded with what by today's standards could be described as light sanctions. Nevertheless, it was enough to cause a noticeable financial crisis in Russia. Not enough to disrupt Putin's position in the Kremlin, but enough to devalue the ruble from 36 to the dollar at the time of the annexation to 61 rubles by the end of 2014. Hence the adoption of what is now called the Fortress Russia strategy. This was the Kremlin's policy to create a reserve fund of rubles and, more broadly, to ensure that the Federation's economy was insulated from Western sanctions. The relevant consequence of this for today is that the Russian central bank has accumulated $600 billion in savings by the time of the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Oddly, roughly half of the money was in Western accounts. This may seem odd, given that the goal here was to isolate Moscow from foreign coercion. Nevertheless, the Western financial system is so pervasive that it is difficult to distribute $600 billion without placing a fair amount of it there. Perhaps some of those funds could have been withdrawn on the eve of the invasion, but remember that the Kremlin was counting on a quick end to the war. This was supposed to be a quick operation. The Kiev government would fall soon, and so the Western sanctions campaign would not have time to take effect. By the way, I know that what makes my channel unique is that I can tell you what peer-reviewed international relations research says about the conflicts going on in our world today. But in a way, I did the opposite. I turned this video into a peer-reviewed article. There's a free access link in the video description, and it's part of a larger symposium I organized on war. Lots of other free reading there, but no tests later, I promise. Anyway, it's really cool that a video that's been watched by almost 6 million people is now becoming part of a peer-reviewed piece. I'm not sure something like this has ever happened before in any field, so thank you all so much for giving me the opportunity to do things like this. Well, now back to the Kremlin's optimism. We all found out very quickly that it was unjustified. Consequently, the Western financial system has frozen $300 billion. The money is still just lying there. Not a penny has been spent, but Russia cannot access these funds, although it's not really clear where the Kremlin should go to get it. It's not clear exactly how much of the money is in the US and how much is in Europe. The bill, which we'll talk about in a minute, suggests that the US only has $4 or $5 billion of these funds. The vast majority is probably in Belgium. France and Germany probably control more of the balance. However, since any future actions with this money are likely to be coordinated among countries on both sides of the Atlantic, this particular detail may not matter much. It is also unclear exactly how much money we are talking about. There was $300 billion, but that $300 billion isn't just sitting in a vault somewhere. Those funds are probably accruing some kind of interest. Even conservative investments in one-year US Treasury bonds are now yielding about 5% per annum. On the other hand, as strange as it is to remember, Interest rates were close to zero at the beginning of the war. So at this point, we are no longer talking about $330 billion. Nevertheless, it's over $300 billion, and those interest rates will become important later. That brings us to what appears in the omnibus bill passed by Congress in April. Let's start with what it literally says. The key difference is that the bill authorizes a shift from asset freezing to asset seizure. So instead of Russia being cut off from access to the accounts, the money transfers will go to some other account. That way, Russia will never have a chance to get its money back because it won't be there anymore. The bill creates the following timeline. Within the first 90 days, Treasury must figure out exactly how much Russian money the US controls and where it is. Then, after another 90 days, Treasury must report its findings to Congress. A month after that, the president can seize, confiscate, transfer, or seize that money. That brings us to November. Biden will still be president, but within 2 months, Trump could be. Regardless, whoever is in power will have the ability to take Russian money and send it to Ukraine to repair the damage caused by the invasion. The bill also mandates that such measures must be taken in conjunction with the G7, the European Union, Australia, and any other parties holding Russian funds. This gives new importance to the upcoming G7 meeting to be held in Italy from June 13 to 15. On the surface, all this sounds like a plus for the West, but in reality, things are much more complicated. Let's look at the main issues and analyze whether they are problematic or not. Let's start with the problems of retaliation on the part of Russia. This has been the Kremlin media's main line of response. It's basically this: the United States takes something away, and Russia retaliates by taking something away as well. The difference, of course, is the significant asymmetry between the two sides. Investing Russian state assets in the West made financial sense. In contrast, Western states did not see Russia as a great place to store dollars or euros. Thus, Uncle Sam does not have a frozen piggy bank in Moscow that the Kremlin can simply rob in response to Washington's seizure of Russian assets. Consequently, the threat of retaliation is that Russia will seize the personal assets of American, British, or European citizens, according to former President Dmitry Medvedev. The added layer of complexity here is that when this happens, the affected American citizens will undoubtedly sue the US government. Yes, Washington didn't take their money directly, but there is a clear causal link by which the government's actions caused the loss of funds. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to guess how this will ultimately turn out, but what I can say is that there may be an injunction against the seizure of frozen Russian assets. Yes, there are already 2 layers of ice. And if the courts rule in favor of private citizens, Ukraine will not get any money until these citizens are fully compensated. Everything will turn into a complicated reorganization of assets without any benefits for anyone. The second category of problems is that the Russian government is not the most reliable place to be. And to a lesser extent, the European Union as well as Australia benefit from being the de facto custodians of the world economy. This has a lot of intangible benefits, but I'll briefly describe one of them. You can borrow money denominated in your own currency. So, if you're the United States and you somehow urgently need to pay off a loan, you can always literally print money for that payment. But imagine you're Argentina and you want to borrow money on the international market. Well, the lenders offer you dollars. You take the money, and when the loans come due, the lenders expect to get the dollars back. Consequently, if you don't have those dollars, you will have to turn to the international markets to buy dollars to pay your debt. In fact, the fact that other countries want to borrow in dollars makes the dollar stronger, and in turn enriches the United States. Combine that with the fact that US treasuries are essentially one of the safest investments, and it leads to a system where the United States can borrow money at ridiculously low rates. That's a good thing when you have a $34 trillion national debt, and you can borrow money at ridiculously low rates. And in 2023, the deficit is $1.7 trillion. In fact, access to cheap credit is one of the main reasons these numbers exist. When it comes to Russian asset seizures, there are serious concerns here about other foreign governments. Normally, they would want to keep some money in Western institutions, but they might worry that their assets might be seized as well. Then they would get out of US treasuries, and interest rates for Washington would suddenly skyrocket. There are fears that this is already happening with China. Indeed, on the eve of the invasion, China held just over $1 trillion in US Treasuries. Now it has $775 billion left. Of course, Beijing began selling off treasuries even before the war. That process began in 2018, and the maximum amount China held was $1.2 trillion. But after the tanks crossed the border, the pace accelerated, and overall, that could lead to a weaker dollar, which is bad for the US economy. There's a good chance you've heard some version of this argument before, but we should take some time to understand why this isn't necessarily a net negative for the West. Imagine a spectrum of countries based on how likely they are to do things that are questionable from the West's perspective. At one end, we have Canada, where I was once threatened with a beating and then a friend interjected that they should do it politely. True story. And at the other end is, say, North Korea. Everyone here isn't even thinking about Western investment, but everyone at the other end is too afraid to provide their financial data. The middle is what matters. Those who deviate slightly in this direction will be frightened of Russian asset seizures and will exit the system. Those who deviate slightly in this direction will not be happy with what is happening, but they are still unlikely to incur the wrath of the West, and so they will stay in the system. So we have 4 groups. The question beyond our keyboard warfare capabilities is how far down the scale the dividing line between the 2 middle groups of countries will be. How wide will that split be? If the split happens here, the precedent of capture will barely affect the world economic structure. If the split happens here, in which case Washington does have to worry that a large enough part of the world will want an alternative, and China will be strongly incentivized to invest in the new system. And as a consequence, the West will lose the more moderate enforcement leverage of an asset freeze the next time something like this happens. But there is another factor. All the discussion is centered on the precedent that the seizure will set and how that will affect the thinking of these guys. There's less focus on the precedent that divestment will set and how that will affect the thinking of these guys. Think about those countries in the middle group that will stay in the system despite complaints about US actions. Let's use as an example here the strange option of Ireland, which is apparently obsessed with dyeing America's precious bodies of water green. Previously, when the opportunity to get out of control arose, they didn't see it as a big disadvantage. Sprinkle green on everything, and that's fine, but move to the post-takeover world, and there is a huge fat disadvantage in their calculations: loss of assets. Because their assets will be seized too. So they'll just give up on getting out of control in the first place, and Americans will be able to drink without fear. So the Western superpower loses leverage over this group, but increases its leverage over that group. I'll leave it to the experts to decide which has more impact. Finally, we come to the main event of the evening. Get ready to get excited because it's time for some lines on the cards. Tonight we're going to focus on the problem of one-time costs, and this is where the game gets tricky. Let's get into it and see who wins. In other words, non-recurring costs are costs that a country can only incur once, and that will not be renewed over time. An attack on an oil refinery, for example, is not a one-time cost because Russia can repair the damage and then Ukraine can inflict that damage again. In contrast, an asset seizure would be a one-time cost. As amusing as it is to think that the Kremlin will call and ask to buy more treasuries immediately after the West seizes their funds, it won't happen. The basic problem is as follows. You have a standard white line representing the hypothetical expected territorial outcome of the war if it were to be brought to a military conclusion. And then you have Russia's red line, and the gap between the two represents its costs of waging the war. If you want Russia to retreat to at least the January 2022 borders as part of the final settlement of this war, then you need to push the red line back somewhere here. This is accomplished either by arming Ukraine to the teeth so that the expected outcome of the war is very favorable to Kyiv, or by imposing such costs on Russia that even a territorial outcome favorable to Moscow would still be a big net disadvantage. Now the problem with any one-time costs is that you can only impose them once. Well, once, and if Western countries do it now, they can't do it again. Moreover, it's hard to imagine that any takeover could be undone, given that the money will have been redistributed by then. Thus, once a takeover takes place, it is no longer a cost of war. It is simply a fact of life that exists regardless of Russia's future military and peace decisions. But it does mean that Russia's costs of waging war until a military outcome is achieved are reduced. And that means that the red line is actually being pushed further into Ukrainian territory. As a result, for the purposes of pushing the red line back, it is better to use the threat of capture than to actually carry it out, at least not until the military outcome of the war is achieved. This is why the West froze these assets initially. They create leverage for negotiation. Now the divergence between the two is not the only reason. The disagreement between the West and Ukraine on this issue is interesting. Ukraine is all in favor of the takeover despite the red line issue. The reason is that even if the red line shifts unfavorably, Kiev will still get a plus in the form of $300 billion regardless of the outcome of the war. In this sense, asset transfers and shifting the line is a zero-sum situation between Russia and Ukraine. One exactly offsets the other. In contrast, the United States values the end of the war by any means relatively more compared to Ukraine, and therefore prefers to have leverage rather than use it. Nevertheless, there are several ways around this problem. First, one is to sell captured assets, raise funds, and then buy more weapons for Ukraine. This narrows the location of the red line due to the loss of leverage, but shifts the line of expected outcome in the other direction, which, in turn, also pushes the red line back. Hence, the overall effect is not entirely clear. If the weapon turns out to be decisive for the outcome of the war, then it is possible that the change in expected outcome more than compensates for the disappearance of costs. Of course, you might argue that the House bill provides for this money to be used to repair the damage from the Russian invasion. But remember that the money is fungible. That is, if more money suddenly starts flowing in for humanitarian purposes, coalition partners and the Ukrainian government will have more money to spend on things that bang loudly, not just funding. This is essentially the problem with sanctions, where the creation of humanitarian exemptions ends up funding the military forces of the object of the sanctions, but vice versa. Second, perhaps paradoxically, war becomes easier to resolve when the costs to the one side are lower. My academically respected alter ego personality has spent a lot of time researching this, and it informs my disrespected version that the conditions for that are not present now, so it's best to move on. If you really want to know how this works, we did a whole video on the subject last year, but it's redundant to the current situation. The last workaround is more of a compromise than a solution. Instead of touching the $300 billion principle, I'll give you a little more time to think about it. Western nations will simply grab the accrued interest. Again, with annual Treasury bond yields around 5% right now, even a very conservative investment strategy would yield about $15 billion a year. The reason this is not a complete solution is that under a complete freeze, the interest would go back into Russia's account. Hence, when the accrued interest goes into the principal, each year of continued war would result in a small increase in the effect on the red line. 15 billion here, 15 billion here, 15 billion here. And in fact, transferring the interest payments to Ukraine means that the red line will decrease every year because of inflation. $300 billion just won't buy what they used to buy. But the good news, my war books are still under $300 billion. You've already seen examples on my channel, and I hope you'll check out one of them. The links are in the video description. And if you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. By the way, that picture of Biden earlier actually depicts him during a briefing on the Wagner mutiny almost a year ago. Funny how the what the heck expression on his face is almost identical to the one we all had at the time. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. I wish you all the best.